Hello, everybody. My name is Adam, and I'm on a quest to be the most prolific reviewer of all time, which means I review a lot of different types of things, but mostly movies. I watched yesterday a movie called Nuremberg that came out last year now in 2025, and it stars Rami Malek and Russell Crowe and a bunch of other supporting actors. And like the title suggests, it deals with the sort of backstory behind the trials of the Nazis after World War II in Nuremberg, the Nuremberg trials. I believe that there was a more famous movie that came out in the 60s called, I forgot what it's called, but I think that there is like another Hollywood treatment of this story. Um, but generally, the movie focuses on the character, on Malek's character, who is Douglas Kelly, and he is a psychologist for the U.S. Army, and he's been tasked with kind of monitoring the psychological health of the inmates and preventing them from committing suicide because obviously the allies don't want these war criminals to kill themselves before they've been actually, you know, put to trial. Um, and how did I think about the movie? What did I think about it? I enjoyed the movie, but it is flawed. So I'd say maybe 7 out of 10. And I saw some reviews of Malek's performance saying that it's silly, and because I will spoil a little bit of the plot. Malek is a failure. Like the character, this Douglas character guy, Kelly guy, is a failure in the story of the film. A few of these main Nazis commit suicide, and he is fired. And he spends his life being very bitter, and then he ends up committing suicide the same way that Hermann Goring does uh, in the movie and in real life. So I think that actually Malek does a good job playing this sort of flawed character because the character does have this really deep sense of self importance. And you can see that he is like judging these Nazis and he's thinking, like, these Nazis are beneath me. I'll be able to like control them and be able to outwit them. It will be very easy. And he finds he he doesn't fall in love with Hermann Goring, but he definitely develops a rapport which is much more friendly than it should be with a war criminal and a Nazi generally. And so he starts to admire Goring. And in the beginning, he hears like this, like rumors that the Nazis have these death camps. And in the course of the trial, the prosecution shows direct evidence that there were these death camps, right? Like the images of dead bodies, interviews with people who were there, um, and so he's shocked then, and he confronts Goring about that, and he's like, How could you do this? How could you know?" And like, he seems like genuinely disappointed, but the fact is that he allowed himself to develop these feelings for Goring, and then he was disappointed that Goring, I don't know how to pronounce it, uh, the fat guy, the fat Nazi bastard, that he disappointed his expectations, like of the actions that he took in the past. So I think that Malek does a really good job of that, like showing this kind of, I don't want to be mean, but kind of weak character, right? And you see like other characters that are surrounding him are stronger. I don't mean that Goring is stronger because he's weak in a different way, but I mean like the the sergeant guy in the army, like the prosecutor, like they're driven by ethics and morality. So I think like the difference between those two is that the Malik's character is driven by um, he's driven by his personal interest, right? His professional interest, and the prosecutor character is driven by ethics and morality. And he doesn't have a. There's a great scene where that prosecutor is lecturing the Pope on what to do, and he doesn't really like uh, after that scene, his aide de camp says like, did you just blackmail the Pope? And he's like, I don't want to talk about it. But it's clear like he has things that he will do so that justice prevails. And they have this scene where the prosecutor is talking to the psychologist, and they're in the ruins of the stadium at Nuremberg. And the prosecutor is like saying, this is what the Nazis did here, you know, and we need to know what their defense is because we need to like discredit them. And the psychologist says something like, oh, that's not fair. And the prosecutor's like, because this expression, which is like the subtext is, what do you mean it's not fair? These people are responsible for the deaths of millions of people. So we're trying to like eradicate their legacy right now. So we're going to be as fair as we possibly can, but these are not like the rules of a normal sort of criminal proceeding. So I think Malik does a good job. And I think Goring does a good job too, but I think that not Goring, Russell Crowe does a good job as Goring. But Goring's character is really kind of reactive in this story. And he says something about how he has like this magic trick that he's going to do at the end because Malik's character is interested in magic. And we'll talk about that in a moment. But just going back to Crowe's performance, I think Russell Crowe is the perfect casting for this because he is charismatic and he has had moments of glory in the past. Like he's been in one of the greatest movies of all time, in my opinion, like Gladiator. So people remember that, but he is not that actor anymore. And so, like, his actual personality is kind of scuzzy, I would say. You listen to interviews with him and you're like, I don't want to be near that guy. So he's charismatic. I'm not saying that he's like Goring because Goring was a particularly vile category of evil there. But he does a good job portraying Goring, at least in this situation where Goring has been arrested. And the courtroom drama is interesting. But I think that they wanted to make this psychologist character a lot more important than he was, because the plot rests on trying to kind of condemn Goring. And the reason that they condemn him, the way that they condemn him is the British prosecutor says something like, if Hitler was alive and he asked you to do these things again, would you do it? And he's like, yes. Yes, I would. And that's like the smoking gun. I don't think you need a psychologist to know that, right? Like all of these people were like so loyal to Hitler, right? It's kind of ridiculous. And I think I understand why they did it, but this was an international trial, right? There were French prosecutors, American prosecutors, Russian prosecutors, British prosecutors, and the only two legal teams that talk are the British prosecutors and the Americans. So you would think that the Russians would have something to say about it too, and they did, right? And I think I get why they did that. It's to sort of kind of take away the more difficult questions that surround this trial, like the fact that the Russians also invaded Poland during 1939, which is a crime that the Nazis were convicted for, and the Russians massacred Polish officers in Katyn. That's a war crime. And, things that the Russians were doing before the war were equally as bad as things that the Nazis were doing before the war. It just wasn't genocide. It was more like, I don't know what you call it when you're not committing genocide on the basis of like they weren't trying to. I mean, they were in sometimes like trying to commit genocide on certain minority groups, but like the Ukrainians. But I think that they were committing genocide against Russians mostly, and I don't know what the word politicide maybe. So the Russians were not exactly clean. So I understand why they didn't do that in this movie. They didn't focus on it. And I think so. Goring, as I alluded to, Goring commits suicide before he can be uh, executed. And his magic trick is basically he has somebody in the prison bring him cyanide, right? And like the psychologist is like so surprised, and this is like a crazy, crazy twist. And, I think that they were surprised in real life because Goring was successful, but as it says in the movie, a lot of these Nazi figures had committed suicide, you know. So, and they were aware of it. And I think so. I think that Malek does a good job and Crowe does a good job. And the direction of the movie, I also have seen it criticized, but I think the direction of the movie is like it's the perfect Hollywood movie. It's not a movie that it asks one big question, but it doesn't have a lot of room for subtext and a lot of room for more difficult or like a lot of other questions about the situation about the Russians I mentioned. And there's a subplot where Goring's wife, so the American psychologist wants to know about Goring, so he wants to know about his family, so he gets to be close to his wife and his children. And then the wife is arrested because she benefited because Goring basically was stealing all of the art around Europe, right? And that's true. Like she was benefiting financially from Goring, right? And she's just a wife, right? But like they they still had like this relationship, right? And that's never questioned. Like he never confronts her and says, your husband did this. What do you think about that? And I think in a maybe braver movie there would be that scene. And I don't know if there was that scene in real life or not. I don't know. But yeah, but basically she gets arrested and he makes this big thing like she should be freed because we're not like them. But like the Nazis arrested people who didn't do anything. They were completely innocent. That was the point, right? So arresting somebody who's guilty of a crime is not the same as arresting somebody who is not guilty of a crime or guilty of a fictitious crime of being born a Jew, you know. So that's a really weird subplot. And so I think I have some other criticisms of the movie which might seem a bit strange, but I've been watching a lot of movies from this time period, like, because I've been on a Betty Davis run recently. And I think I can understand it, but the more and more I see period pieces, it really, really annoys me because they have all of these like uniforms and equipment and they want it to be accurate. So they have like a lot of vintage uniforms, especially the Americans when they arrest Goring. So the Americans are wearing these so vintage means like they're 70 years old or whatever, uniforms to arrest Goring, and the color is like faded. And it looks, on the one hand, it's realistic because those are really the uniforms that the soldiers would wear. But on the other hand, it's completely I can't say that word, but it's American soldiers would not be wearing 70-year-old uniforms to arrest Goring, so it looks like crap. is what I'm saying. It's authentic, but it looks like crap. So it's kind of those things where they're kind of damned if they do and damned if they don't. And there's like a lot of scenes like that where there's scenes in cafes and restaurants and they just look inauthentic. And this is going to sound weird, but you know, when you go to a Shakespeare play and they do something like, I saw one production of Romeo and Juliet where it was set in Nazi Germany, so they updated the costumes so that they looked like in the 1930s, or you see Romeo and Juliet and it's put on in modern costumes. I think that's what they should do with stories like this. They should have like I mean, no, I know it would look weird, but you can get American uniforms that are new right now, like I mean, I don't. You'd have to create the Nazi uniforms because obviously Germans don't wear Nazi uniforms anymore. But I don't know. I don't know. Maybe that's a bit extreme. And I think one thing, a similar thing that I saw in this movie, which was about the same kind of thing. I'm rambling a little bit, but what I mean is they had a lot of these fake newsreels. Maybe not a lot. There were two or three. And you have a modern voice trying to imitate a newsreel of that time. And it's just very jarring because you know it's not the same thing. And the reason it's so jarring is because during the trial section, they actually use real footage that the Americans showed during the trial, which is like a newsreel thing. And you have this American soldier who's been a prisoner of war for 3 or 4 years and almost starves to death. And he makes a joke, like, which it doesn't land very well because he's in the middle of a concentration camp, but he makes a joke. He's like, yeah, surprisingly, you haven't seen me on film before, you know, which is probably, I think, one of the best jokes ever because can you imagine the cojones of that guy to make a joke like that in that situation? But he's describing, and he's kind of really wooden because he's not an actor, right? But he's like describing what types of punishment the Nazis had, and you know, you have like the narrator who's being very subdued, and the whole thing like the Nazis did this, the Nazis did this, the Nazis did this, and but in the recreations in the film, it's like, what are the boys? You know, it just sounds so off. So I think if you're going to use footage from that time, like especially newsreel footage, you should make it like, you know, you should use the real thing and not try to recreate it, or recreate the entire thing and not use the real ones so nobody has comparisons. And about the costumes, I just decided you can make the costumes, right? Like you can base the US soldier uniforms on the patterns that they had and make new ones so that they look like they would be things that had been issued in the last year or whatever, and not like 70-year-old uniforms. But those are really, I mean, I've been talking a lot about that, but those are really minor details. And I think, as I said, the movie is about 7 out of 10. So I think it's worth watching. What did you think about the movie? If you've seen it, leave your thoughts in the comments. I am trying to get to 250 subscribers by the end of January, which is in 28 days, I guess. But we have 242 at the moment, so I believe it's completely possible. And if you're listening on Spotify, please give me a follow. All right, thank you. Bye-bye.